Hey everybody. This is a passage from Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. The piece I'm reading from today is about, I'm trying to find it, Fritz Sternberg. This is under the heading, this is under the chapter, in the chapter, excuse me. This is in the chapter, from the, quote, Great Patriotic War, end quote, to the structural assimilation of Eastern Europe, 1941 to 1956. The section it's under is interpretations, quote, without labels, end quote. I'm going to read the little introduction to this chapter that's like a half a page before I read the Sternberg section. In the beginning of the 1950s, an interesting theoretical development occurred. Several independent Marxists, all from West Germany, abandoned the labels used from the 1930s onward to describe the Soviet Union. They regarded these labels as too hasty and tried to formulate new theories which were more, quote, open, end quote, than the old approaches. These authors were not so much searching for a correct description, but for a theory that was as consistent as possible with the observable facts. Even those among them who still cherished older theories admitted their reluctance in ascribing any traditional, quote, label, end quote, to the Soviet Union. Thus, for example, Helmut Fleischer, who considered that a bourgeois degeneration had occurred in the Soviet Union, remarked, quote, an unambiguous definition of Stalinist Russia can only be given if the historical origin of this regime and its place in history is appropriately taken into account. Both these points are much more essential than the name which one might select, end quote. Helmut Fleischer accordingly refused to use labels like, quote, state capitalism, quote, degenerated workers' state, or, quote, bureaucratic collectivism. Footnote, Lenz, 1950. That Lenz was a pseudonym of Helmut Fleischer was revealed in a letter by Fleischer to the author dated the 3rd of February, 1987. End footnote. Probably this temporary anti-dogmatism was related to the split between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union in 1949 and the reemergence of a Titoist movement in the Federal Republic of Germany under the name of Independent Workers' Party, UAP. Footnote. See on this topic Kuhlmann, 1978. This party should not be confused with the right-wing extremist Unabhängige Arbeiterpartei, founded in 1962. End footnote. While the UAP was a phenomenon of short duration, the party existed only from 1950 to 1951, and while Tito's most important ideologist, Milovan Žilas, defended a variant of the theory of state capitalism in this period, it seems that the corrosion of communist orthodoxy which it evinced also stimulated other more daring interpretations. The new heterodoxy became visible both in the left wing of the German social democracy as well as in the circles around the UAP. All right, so now we're at the Sternberg section. The inspiration, because I was like, what am I going to read today? And the inspiration for reading this was I was listening to The Myth of the Transitional Society by Adam Buick, which is on this channel. I was listening to myself speak. And he had referencing Fritz Sternberg. And so I want to see what he had to say, because I knew he had a section in this book. I've read this before, but it's like you read something one time and you forget it all. The economist Fritz Sternberg, who lived from 1895 to 1963, who was known internationally since 1926 when he published his main work, Imperialismus, made some contributions to the analysis of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 1950s. From these writings, it is clear that Sternberg was no longer close to Trotskyism as he had been 20 years earlier, but had meantime developed his own variant of, quote, democratic socialism, end quote. In his wide-ranging book, Capitalism and Socialism on Trial, published in 1951, Sternberg tried, among other things, to analyze and outline the development of Russian society since 1917, with due regard for the changing world situation. Significant in the first instance was that he resisted, unlike many others, any inclination to labeling Russia. Sternberg almost never referred to the, quote, Soviet Union, end quote, had, on the one hand, put an end to the feudal relationships at home and had also eradicated capitalism. On the other hand, neither socialism nor anything resembling socialism had been established. Instead, a repressive party dictatorship had emerged, which continued some czarist traditions. Politically considered, the result of this ambivalent situation, which according to Sternberg had been historically inevitable, was a hybrid form of society which mixed progressive and reactionary tendencies. Quote, it is useless to attempt to cover it, bracket, i.e. the new state form, end bracket, with a name. It is misleading to mistake one side of the Russian development for the other. End quote. Sternberg, 1951. Capitalism and Socialism on Trial. In Sternberg's reconstruction of development since the October Revolution, Sternberg noted many aspects which had already been identified by others as well. The shrinking social basis of the party dictatorship, as shown by the statification of the trade unions, the tendency to autarky in the world market, etc. In so doing, Sternberg pointed out that the party dictatorship had initially, under Lenin, been directed primarily at the old exploiters, but had gradually more and more evolved into a dictatorship which, through a drastic intervention in the standard of living of the workers and peasants, had forced an industrialization process. To these already well-known ideas, Sternberg added two new elements. Firstly, Sternberg believed that the collectivization of agriculture could be correctly understood if one recognized its results as parallel with the Asiatic mode of production. Namely, the fact that the state owned the machinery of the agrarian collectives, tractor and such like, meant that these collectives were just as dependent on the state as the village communities were in the old China. It is unclear whether or not this judgment was influenced by Wittvogel's work. But, if so, then Sternberg certainly approached the theory of Oriental despotism in a very modern way, by interpreting the water economy only as an analogy. Secondly, Sternberg was prepared to call the post-war expansion of the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe, quote, red imperialism, end quote, with the proviso that a quite different imperialism was involved from capitalist imperialism. While capitalism implemented a coalition with the big landowners in its colonies, the USSR promoted agrarian revolutions, while capitalism broke the industrialization of the colonies. The USSR, to the contrary, stimulated agrarian revolutions. And while capitalism expanded in order to sell capitalism's surplus of commodities for high profits, the Soviet Union experienced a shortage of goods and had no need to sell them elsewhere. In short, the social content of, quote, red imperialism, end quote, was completely different from the content of Western imperialism. This also meant, according to Sternberg, that for the Soviet Union no inherent necessity for expansion existed, although such an expansion might have a certain utility for the maintenance of the regime. In the same year his book was published, Sternberg also published a pamphlet about the Soviet Union titled So It Ends. In this work, Sternberg advanced broadly the same ideas, with one important difference. No longer did he refer to a society with combined progressive and reactionary tendencies, but rather to the, quote, most reactionary state in the world, end quote, which globally needed to be fought on every level, political, militarily, and ideologically. The End. That was the section from Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union on Fritz Sternberg, which is located in Chapter 4, From the Great Patriotic War to the Structural Assimilation of Eastern Europe, in the section Interpretations, quote, without labels, end quote.